Harold Winters, a lonely 78-year-old, receives a terminal diagnosis that forces him to confront a life of regrets. Determined to make peace with his past, he embarks on a final cross-country journey. Along the way, Harold meets Jake, a young man fleeing his own mistakes. Together, they form an unlikely friendship that helps them face their demons. Harold's journey leads him back to the children he long abandoned, David, a lawyer in Chicago, and Sarah, an artist in California. As he battles time, Harold tries to mend the broken family ties and find redemption. Through painful conversations, moments of unexpected joy, and the creation of new memories, the Winters family slowly begins to heal old wounds. Harold discovers that his true last wish is not just forgiveness, but the chance to finally be the father and grandfather his family deserves. This is a touching story about second chances, the power of forgiveness, and the importance of cherishing the moments we have with those we love, before it's too late. The monotonous sound of the heart monitor echoed through the sterile room at Boston General Hospital. Harold Winters, a 78-year-old man with graying hair and faded blue eyes, sat at the edge of the hospital bed, his trembling hands holding a white envelope. Inside it was the result of a series of tests he had undergone over the past few weeks. Dr. Sarah Chin, a middle-aged oncologist with compassionate features, entered the room. Her white coat rustled softly as she approached Harold. "Mr. Winters," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I have your test results." Harold looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. "No need to sugarcoat it, doctor. How much time do I have left?" Dr. Chin pulled a chair and sat in front of Harold. "The cancer has spread faster than we expected. With aggressive treatment, we could extend it by a few months, maybe a year. Without treatment..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We estimate between 3 to 6 months." Harold closed his eyes, letting the news sink in. It wasn't exactly a surprise. He had been feeling weaker over the past months, and something deep inside him had already known his time was running out. "I see," he murmured, opening his eyes again. "I guess there's no point in prolonging the inevitable, is there?" Dr. Chin leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on Harold's arm. "Mr. Winters, there are options. We could try chemotherapy, there are new experimental treatments." Harold shook his head, gently interrupting her. "No, doctor. I've spent my whole life working, saving, planning for a future that never seemed to arrive. Now that I know my time is limited, I want to live it, not spend it in hospitals fighting the inevitable." The doctor nodded, respecting her patient's decision. "I understand, Mr. Winters. We'll make sure you're as comfortable as possible. Is there anyone you'd like us to contact? Family, friends?" A bitter smile crossed Harold's lips. "Family? My wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. My kids..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Well, let's just say they have their own lives now. As for friends, most of them are gone or in a similar situation as mine." Dr. Chin felt a pang of sadness. It wasn't uncommon to see elderly patients alone, but it always affected her. "Mr. Winters, there are support services, groups of..." "Don't worry about me, doctor," Harold interrupted her again, this time with a more genuine smile. "I have plans." "Plans?" Dr. Chin asked, intrigued. Harold stood up slowly, his knees cracking in protest. He walked over to the hospital window, looking out at the Boston skyline. The skyscrapers rose against the summer blue sky, and in the distance, he could see a glimpse of the Atlantic Ocean. "You know, doctor," he began, his voice gaining a note of determination, "I've spent my entire life in this city. I was born here, grew up here, worked here. But I've always dreamed of seeing the rest of the country." He turned to face the doctor, his eyes shining with a spark of life that hadn't been there moments before. "I think it's time to make that dream come true. One last trip, one last wish." Dr. Chen stood up, moving closer to Harold. "A trip across the country? Alone?" Harold shrugged. "Why not? What do I have to lose? Better than sitting at home waiting for the end to come." The doctor hesitated for a moment, worried about the medical implications of such a journey. But seeing the determination in Harold's eyes, she realized that this might be exactly the medicine he needed. "Well, Mr. Winters, if that's what you want, we'll make sure you're prepared. I'll prescribe medication to help with the symptoms and give you some recommendations to make your trip as comfortable as possible." Harold smiled, genuinely grateful. "Thank you, Doctor. You know, for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to tomorrow." As Dr. Chen left the room to arrange the necessary paperwork, Harold turned his gaze back to the window. The afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden glow, as if the world was welcoming him to his last great adventure. In the days that followed, Harold found himself filled with an energy he hadn't felt in years. His small apartment in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, once a quiet and solitary refuge, now buzzed with activity. Maps were scattered across the kitchen table, travel guides were stacked on the sofa, and an old suitcase, unearthed from the back of the closet, lay open in the middle of the living room. As he carefully folded a few shirts and placed them in the suitcase, Harold caught himself smiling. It was strange how the prospect of impending death had given his life a new purpose. Every item he chose to bring seemed laden with meaning, as if it were a silent testament to his existence. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his reverie. Opening it, Harold found his neighbor, Mrs. Rosalie Thompson, a widow in her early 70s who lived next door. "Harold, dear," she said, holding a covered dish, "I thought I'd bring some apple pie. I heard you were leaving and thought you might like a snack for the trip." Harold smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Rosalie, you're an angel. Please, come in." Mrs. Thompson entered, her eyes scanning the disarray in the apartment. "Goodness, Harold, it looks like you're preparing for an expedition to the North Pole." Harold chuckled, taking the dish and placing it on the kitchen table. "Well, not quite that far north, but almost as ambitious. I'm planning a trip across the country." Rosalie's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Alone? Harold, are you sure that's wise, considering?" She didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Harold sighed, sitting at the table and motioning for Rosalie to join him. "Rosalie, I'll be frank with you. The doctors gave me a few months to live. I can spend that time here, waiting for the inevitable, or I can go out and see everything I've always wanted to see." Rosalie put her hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh, Harold, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Don't be. You know, for the first time in years, I truly feel alive. I have a purpose, a goal." Rosalie wiped away a tear, nodding slowly. "I understand. But promise me you'll take care of yourself, will you? And call every now and then so this old lady won't worry?" Harold smiled, feeling a wave of affection for his neighbor. "I promise, Rosalie. And when I get back, I'll tell you all about my travels over a cup of tea and your delicious pies." They both knew it was a promise that would likely not be fulfilled, but the gesture meant a lot. After Rosalie left, Harold returned to his task of packing with renewed vigor. The next morning, Harold was up before dawn. He showered, dressed carefully, and made one final check of his suitcase. Beside it was a small bag containing the medications prescribed by Dr. Chen and some provisions for the journey. As the first rays of sunlight began to light up the Boston skyline, Harold grabbed his bags and left the apartment. In the hallway, to his surprise, he found Rosalie waiting for him. "You didn't think I'd let you leave without a proper goodbye, did you?" she said, her eyes shining with a mix of sadness and warmth. Harold hugged her, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for everything, Rosalie. You've been a wonderful friend. Go and have your adventures, Harold Winters," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "And remember, there will always be an apple pie waiting for you here." With one last wave, Harold made his way down the stairs and out to the street. The crisp morning air greeted him, carrying with it the promise of new horizons. He walked to a nearby garage, where his old 1967 Chevrolet Impala, a treasure he'd kept in excellent condition over the years, awaited him. Placing his bags in the trunk, Harold took one last look at the building that had been his home for so many years. For a moment, he felt a pang of doubt. Was he really doing the right thing? But then, looking at the road ahead, he felt that spark of excitement again. Yes, he was doing exactly what he needed to do. Harold started the car, the engine roaring to life as if it shared in his excitement. Tuning the radio to a classical music station, he smiled as the first notes of Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra filled the air. "Well," he said to himself, "it seems the universe approves of my journey." And with that, Harold Winters left Boston, leaving behind a life of routines and unfulfilled expectations, heading into the unknown. The road stretched out before him, an open invitation to adventure, discovery, and perhaps, redemption. 3 days after leaving Boston, Harold found himself crossing the vast plains of Kansas. The monotonous landscape of golden wheat fields stretched to the horizon, occasionally interrupted by lone silos or small farms. The sky, a deep blue, seemed infinite, punctuated only by a few lazy clouds. Harold was tired, but in a good way. The long hours of driving had given him time to reflect on his life, his choices, and the regrets he carried. He thought about Martha, his late wife, and the good times they had shared. He thought about his children, David and Sarah, and the distance that had grown between them over the years. There was so much he wished he had done differently, so many words left unsaid. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw a lone figure by the side of the road. As he approached, Harold realized it was a young man, no more than in his early 20s, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and his thumb extended, the universal sign of a hitchhiker. Normally, Harold would have driven right by. After all, picking up hitchhikers was dangerous, especially for a man his age. But something about the young man made him slow down. Maybe it was the tired expression on his face, or maybe it was just the desire for some company after days alone on the road. Harold pulled the car over a few meters ahead of the young man. In the rearview mirror, he watched as the young man ran towards the car, a mix of relief and apprehension on his face. "Hey, thanks for stopping," said the young man, breathless, leaning into the passenger window. "I'm trying to get to Denver. Do you think you could give me a ride, at least part of the way?" Harold studied the young man for a moment. He had dark, tousled hair, alert green eyes, and a scruffy beard from a few days without shaving. His clothes were a bit worn, and there was a tension in his posture, as if ready to bolt at any moment. "Denver, huh?" Harold replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "Well, it just so happens that's my next destination. Why don't you hop in? We could keep each other company." The relief on the young man's face was palpable. "Really? Man, you're a lifesaver. Thanks so much." The young man threw his backpack into the back seat and settled into the passenger seat. Harold noticed that he discreetly sniffed the air, probably trying to gauge whether there was anything suspicious or dangerous. "I'm Harold," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Harold Winters." The young man hesitated for a moment before shaking the offered hand. Jake. Jake Morrison. As they got back on the road, Harold couldn't help but notice Jake's nervousness. The young man kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands fidgeting in his lap. So, Jake, Harold began, trying to break the ice, what takes you to Denver? Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Oh, just looking for a fresh start, I guess. Harold nodded, recognizing the evasiveness in the young man's response. A fresh start, huh? I know that feeling well. Spent my whole life thinking about fresh starts, but always putting them off. Jake looked at Harold with curiosity. And now? Is this a fresh start for you? A wistful smile crossed the old man's face. Something like that. Let's just say I'm making my final farewell tour. Silence fell between them for a few moments, with only the sound of the engine and the wind passing by the car filling the air. Jake seemed to be struggling internally, as if debating whether or not to share something. Finally, he spoke. I did something bad. I'm running away. Harold kept his eyes on the road, but his expression softened. I see. Do you want to talk about it? Jake hesitated, but something in Harold's calm presence seemed to encourage him. I used to work at a convenience store in a small town in Missouri. The owner, he was a terrible guy. Treated everyone like crap, especially the employees. One night, I was closing up, and, well, there was a lot of money in the till. Harold remained silent, letting Jake continue at his own pace. I didn't plan it, I swear. It was an impulse. I took the money and ran. It wasn't much, maybe $2,000, but... Jake swallowed. Now I can't go back. I messed everything up. Harold let out a long sigh. Jake, life is about choices. Some good, some not so good. The important thing isn't the mistake we made, but what we do afterward. Jake looked at Harold, a mix of surprise and relief on his face. You're not going to turn me in. Or anything? Harold chuckled softly. Kid, I'm too old to be judging others. Besides, I have my own regrets to deal with. But let me tell you something, running away from problems rarely solves them. The young man hung his head, the shame evident in his posture. I know. But I don't know what to do now. Well, Harold said, a glint of determination in his eyes, how about we start by solving it together? We've got a long drive ahead, and maybe we can figure out a solution along the way. Jake looked at Harold with a mix of gratitude and hope. You'd really help me? Harold smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Sure. After all, what's a good road trip without a bit of redemption, right? As the '67 Impala continued its journey across the plains of Kansas toward the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, an unlikely friendship began to form. Harold, burdened by a lifetime of regrets and the knowledge of his limited time, and Jake, a young man seeking redemption, found in each other an unexpected chance to make peace with their pasts. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The road ahead seemed endless, but for the first time in a long time, both Harold and Jake felt they were heading in the right direction. Claro, aquí está tragicao para o Ingles Americano. Night had fallen on the road, wrapping the Chevrolet Impala in a shroud of darkness broken only by the car's headlights and the occasional glow of passing vehicles. Harold and Jake had settled into a comfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. I think we should stop and rest, Harold finally said, breaking the silence. These old eyes aren't what they used to be for night driving. Jake nodded, looking relieved. Sounds like a good idea. Got any place in mind? Harold pointed at a sign that passed by quickly. Looks like there's a motel a few miles ahead. How about that? 20 minutes later, they were parked in front of a modest roadside motel. The neon sign flickered faintly, announcing vacancies in faded red letters. After checking in, the two found themselves in a simple room with two twin beds. Jake tossed his backpack onto one of the beds and sat down, running his hands over his tired face. Harold watched the young man for a moment before speaking. "You know, Jake, I think it's time we were completely honest with each other." Jake looked up, a wary expression crossing his face. "What do you mean?" Harold sat down on the other bed, facing Jake directly. "Well, for starters, I'm not just on a leisure trip. The truth is, I'm dying. Cancer. The doctors gave me a few months to live." Jake's eyes widened in shock. "Oh my God, Harold. I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Harold waved dismissively. "Don't be. In fact, this diagnosis is what gave me the courage to finally take this trip. But there's more." He paused, gathering his courage. "I have 2 children. David and Sarah. I haven't seen them in years. We drifted apart." Jake leaned forward, genuinely interested. "What happened?" Harold let out a long sigh. "Life happened, I guess. I was a workaholic, always focused on building a better future for my family. But in the process, I lost the present. Missed birthdays, recitals, soccer games. When my wife Martha passed away 5 years ago, I realized how much time I had wasted. But by then, it was too late. My kids had their own lives, their own families. And I was practically a stranger to them." Jake was silent for a moment, absorbing the story. "Do they know about the cancer?" Harold shook his head. "No. I haven't had the courage to tell them. In fact, part of this trip is an attempt to gather the courage to see them one last time. To try to make things right before it's too late." The room was quiet for a few moments, the weight of Harold's words hanging in the air. Finally, Jake spoke. "Harold, I didn't just steal $2,000. Harold raised an eyebrow, waiting for Jake to continue. "It was $20,000, Jake confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "The store owner kept the week's sales in the safe. I knew the combination. It was premeditated. I planned it for weeks." Harold nodded slowly, processing the information. "I see. And what drove you to do it, Jake?" Jake swallowed hard, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "My younger sister, Lily. She has cystic fibrosis. Treatments are expensive, and my parents are drowning in medical debt. I thought I could help. But now," he buried his face in his hands. "Now I've just made everything worse. I can't even go back home. The police are probably looking for me." Harold got up and sat next to Jake, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Jake, what you did was wrong, no doubt about that. But your intentions, well, they came from a place of love. That counts for something." Jake looked at Harold, his eyes red and brimming with tears. "What do I do now, Harold? How can I make this right?" Harold took a deep breath, thinking for a moment. "Well, I think we have 2 options here. We can keep running, hoping the problem magically disappears. Or, Jake asked, a spark of hope in his voice. "Or we can face it head on," Harold concluded. "Go back, return the money, face the consequences. It won't be easy, but it could be the first step to making things right." Jake remained silent for a long time, considering Harold's words. Finally, he spoke. What if we do it together? I'll go back and face what I did, and you'll see your kids? Harold felt a lump form in his throat. The idea of facing his children after all this time scared him more than the thought of death. But looking at Jake, seeing the courage the young man was gathering, he felt a wave of determination. You know what, Jake? I think we've got a deal. The two men looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. That night, in a motel somewhere between Kansas and Colorado, two lost souls found a common purpose and the courage to face their pasts. As the night wore on and the sound of cars passing on the highway lulled the motel, Harold and Jake finally drifted off to sleep, their dreams filled with fears of what was to come but also with a fragile hope of redemption. Dawn found Harold and Jake already on the road. They had decided to change their plans. Instead of heading to Denver, they were now heading back east, toward the small town in Missouri that Jake had fled from. The '67 Impala cut through the morning mist, its engine purring softly as it swallowed up the miles. The silence inside the car was palpable, heavy with apprehension and anticipation. Are you sure you want to do this? Harold finally asked, casting a sideways glance at Jake. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No, he admitted. But it's the right thing to do, isn't it? Harold nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. Yes, it is. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's usually worth it in the end. They continued in silence for a while longer, each lost in his own thoughts. It was Jake who broke the silence this time. And you, Harold? Still planning on seeing your kids? The old man sighed deeply. Yes, I think so. After we help you sort this out, I'm thinking of going to Chicago. That's where David lives with his family. Sarah is in California, but, well, one step at a time, right? Jake nodded, a small smile forming on his face. One step at a time. As the day wore on, the landscape around them gradually changed. The vast open fields of Kansas gave way to the rolling hills of Missouri. Signs for towns increasingly familiar to Jake began to appear, visibly increasing his anxiety. By late afternoon, they finally reached the outskirts of the small town of Oakville, Missouri. Jake grew visibly tense at the sight of the town's welcome sign. This is it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Harold slowed down, entering the town. The streets were quiet, typical of a Sunday afternoon in a small American town. A few people walked along the sidewalks, casting curious glances at the vintage Impala. Where's the store? Harold asked softly. Jake pointed to a street on the right. 2 blocks that way. It's a convenience store called Miller's Mart. Harold nodded and turned the car in the indicated direction. As they got closer, Jake grew paler. Harold, he began, but his voice faltered. It's okay, son, Harold said, his voice firm but gentle. You're doing the right thing. Remember that. Finally, they spotted the store. It was a modest establishment with a red brick facade and a faded sign announcing Miller's Mart open 24 hours. Harold parked the car across the street. Ready? He asked, looking at Jake. The young man took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was a determination in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Ready, he replied. They got out of the car and crossed the street toward the store. Jake hesitated for a moment at the door, but he felt Harold's reassuring hand on his shoulder. With one last breath, he pushed the door open and walked in. The inside of the store was quiet, with only the hum of the refrigerators breaking the silence. A middle-aged man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter. When he looked up and saw Jake, his expression changed from boredom to shock and then to anger. "You damn thief," he yelled, coming out from behind the counter. "How dare you show your face here again?" Jake took a step back instinctively, but Harold placed himself between him and the furious man. "Mr. Miller, I presume?" Harold said, his voice calm but firm. "I think we all need to have a conversation." Mr. Miller stopped, looking suspiciously at Harold. "And who the hell are you?" Harold remained calm, acting as an intermediary between Jake and Mr. Miller. "My name is Harold Winters, sir. I'm here to help resolve this situation in a way that's fair for everyone involved." Mr. Miller snorted, his face still red with anger. "Fair? This kid stole $20,000 from me. What's fair about that?" Jake stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Miller, I came to return the money." Mr. Miller's expression changed from anger to surprise. "Return?" Harold nodded. "Yes, Mr. Miller. Jake understands what he did was wrong and wants to make it right." Mr. Miller looked from Harold to Jake, distrust still evident in his eyes. "And why should I believe you?" Jake slowly pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. With trembling hands, he held it out to Mr. Miller. "Here it is. $20,000. I'm really sorry, Mr. Miller. I truly am." Mr. Miller took the envelope, opening it with skepticism. His eyes widened as he counted the money. "It's all here," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Harold took advantage of the moment to intervene. "Mr. Miller, I understand that what Jake did was seriously wrong. But he's here, of his own free will, to correct his mistake. That has to count for something, doesn't it?" Mr. Miller looked at Jake, who kept his head down, shame evident in his posture. After a long moment of silence, he spoke. Why did you steal the money?" Jake looked up, meeting Mr. Miller's gaze for the first time. "My little sister, she's sick. Cystic fibrosis. The treatments are expensive, and my parents, they're drowning in debt. I thought I could help." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I was wrong. Stealing is never the answer, no matter the reason. I understand that now." Mr. Miller remained silent for a long time, his gaze shifting between Jake and the envelope in his hands. Finally, he let out a long sigh. "Look, kid, what you did was wrong. Very wrong. But," he paused, seeming to struggle internally. "But you came back. You returned the money. That counts for something." Jake looked at Mr. Miller, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Mr. Miller, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. If you want to call the police, I understand. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions." Mr. Miller shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not calling the police. But you're going to work for me, for free, for the next 6 months. Every cent you would earn will go to pay for all the trouble you caused. Understood?" Jake nodded vigorously, a smile of relief spreading across his face. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you, I promise." Harold watched the scene with a soft smile. He could feel the weight lifting from Jake's shoulders, redemption beginning to take shape. Mr. Miller turned to Harold. "And you, sir. Thank you for bringing the boy back. Not everyone would have done that." Harold shrugged modestly. "Sometimes, all we need is a second chance and someone to show us the right way." As they finalized the details of the agreement, the store door opened, and a young woman entered hurriedly. She stopped abruptly when she saw Jake. "Jake?" she exclaimed, her voice a mixture of shock and relief. Jake turned, his eyes widening. "Lucy? What are you doing here?" The young woman ran to Jake, pulling him into a tight hug. "You idiot! We were all so worried. Where have you been?" Jake returned the hug, tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Lucy. I made a terrible mistake. But I'm trying to fix things now." Lucy pulled back, looking at Jake with a mixture of anger and relief. "Do you have any idea what you put Mom and Dad through? What you put Lily through? She asks about you every day." Jake hung his head, guilt evident in his expression. "I know. I'm going to make it all right, Lucy. I promise." Harold watched the scene, feeling a pang in his heart. He couldn't help but think about his own children, about how they would react when he finally saw them. Mr. Miller cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Well, I think we've got a lot to sort out here. Jake, you start tomorrow at 7 a.m. Don't be late." Jake nodded, a genuine smile on his face for the first time in days. "I'll be here, sir. Thank you. Thank you for everything." While Jake talked to Lucy, explaining everything that had happened, Harold discreetly stepped away. He left the store and crossed the street to his car, sitting in the driver's seat. Looking out the window, he saw Jake and Lucy leaving the store, holding hands. Jake looked around, searching for Harold, and when he saw him in the car, he waved with a grateful smile. Harold returned the wave, feeling a mix of emotions. Joy for helping Jake find his way back, but also a twinge of sadness. His journey with the young man had come to an end, and now he faced his own lonely road ahead. With one last look at Jake, who was now walking down the street with Lucy, probably on their way to their parents' house, Harold started the Impala's engine. The familiar rumble filled the air, as if eager to get back on the road. Harold looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Chicago awaited him. And with it, the prospect of facing his own past. "Well, old friend," he murmured to himself, patting the steering wheel, "looks like our real journey is just beginning." With that, Harold shifted into first gear and drove away, leaving the small town of Oakville behind. Ahead of him, the road stretched out, an open invitation to the next chapter of his journey. A chapter that, he hoped, would lead him back home, whatever home meant now. The highway stretched before Harold like an endless ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the Midwest plains. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as the old Chevrolet Impala devoured the miles toward Chicago. Harold drove in silence, his thoughts a confusing mix of anxiety and determination. Jake's absence was palpable. The young man had become a comforting presence during his journey. Now, alone again, Harold found himself facing his own demons. As night fell, the headlights cut through the darkness, and Harold found himself reflecting on his life, on the choices that had brought him here. He thought about Martha, his late wife, and wondered what she would say about this crazy trip he had embarked on. She'd probably laugh and say it was about time he did something impulsive. The hours passed, punctuated only by occasional stops for coffee and to stretch his legs. At each stop, Harold found himself looking at his phone, David's number saved on the screen, his finger hovering over the call button. But each time, he hesitated and put the phone back in his pocket. What would he say? How could he explain years of absence in a simple phone call? On the morning of the second day of driving, Harold finally saw the sign, "Welcome to Illinois." His heart leapt. He was getting close. Chicago was only a few hours away. As he drove through Chicago's suburbs, memories began flooding his mind. He remembered the last time he was here, for David's wedding. It had been a happy day, but also strange. He had felt like a stranger, watching his son's life from the outside, unable to truly be part of it. Finally, Harold entered the city proper. The skyscrapers rose against the blue sky, traffic grew denser, and the sound of the big city enveloped him. Following the GPS instructions, he navigated the streets until he reached a quiet residential neighborhood. He parked the car in front of a two-story house with a small garden in front, feeling his heart race. This was it. David's house. For long minutes, he sat in the car, looking at the house. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of movement. Maybe no one was home. Maybe this was a terrible idea, and he should just turn around and... No. He had come this far. He couldn't give up now. Taking a deep breath, Harold got out of the car. His legs trembled slightly as he walked along the stone path to the front door. He paused for a moment, gathering courage, and then rang the doorbell. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Harold could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. And then, finally, the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. The door opened, and Harold found himself face to face with a middle-aged man, dark hair streaked with gray, brown eyes identical to his own. "Dad?" David said, his voice a mix of shock and disbelief. Harold felt a lump form in his throat. "Hello, David," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to say hello." David stood there for a moment, clearly stunned by his father's sudden appearance. Then, slowly, his expression softened. "Well, I guess you better come in then," he said, opening the door wider. Harold nodded, grateful, and stepped inside his son's house. As the door closed behind him, he knew he was crossing more than just a physical threshold. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life, a chapter that he hoped would bring healing and forgiveness. The inside of the house was cozy, with family photos adorning the walls and toys scattered across the living room floor. Harold felt a pang of regret as he realized how many moments he had missed, how many memories he hadn't been part of. David led him to the kitchen, a spacious, well-lit room with a large island in the center. "Want some coffee?" he asked, his voice still carrying a tone of uncertainty. "Yes, please," Harold replied, grateful for the familiarity of the routine. While David prepared the coffee, an uncomfortable silence hung between them. Harold looked around, noticing more photos on the fridge, David with a blonde woman, probably his wife, and two smiling children. "Your kids?" Harold asked softly, pointing to the photos. David looked over his shoulder, a small smile forming on his lips. "Yeah. Emily is 10 and Michael is 7. Harold felt his heart tighten. Grandchildren. He had grandchildren he barely knew. David turned, two steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He placed one in front of Harold and sat on the other side of the island. "So," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "what brings you to Chicago, Dad?" Harold held the warm cup, letting the heat warm his trembling hands. I'm on a trip. A sort of journey of self-discovery, you could say." He paused, gathering courage. "And I realized there were things I needed to fix. People I needed to see." David raised an eyebrow. "And that includes us now? After all these years?" The pain in his son's voice was palpable, and Harold felt as if he had taken a punch to the gut. "David, he began, but the words failed him. How could he explain? How could he ask for forgiveness for years of neglect? At that moment, the front door opened, and animated voices filled the house. "Daddy, we're home," a young voice called. David stood up. In the kitchen, he called back. Seconds later, 2 hurricanes of energy ran into the kitchen, followed by a blonde woman. They all stopped abruptly at the sight of Harold. "Kids, Claire," David said, his voice tense, This is Grandpa Harold." The children's eyes widened, looking from David to Harold with curiosity. Claire, David's wife, stepped forward, extending her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Winters," she said, her voice warm but with a note of caution. Harold stood, shaking her hand. "The pleasure is mine, Claire. And please, call me Harold." The children, Emily and Michael, looked at Harold with a mix of curiosity and shyness. Emily, the older one, was the first to speak. "Are you really our grandpa?" Harold felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, I am," he replied softly. "And I'm very happy to finally meet you both." Michael, the younger one, hid behind Claire's legs, but his curious eyes never left Harold. David cleared his throat, breaking the moment of tension. "Kids, why don't you go wash your hands and then come back to get to know Grandpa Harold better?" The children nodded and ran off, leaving the adults in an awkward silence. Claire looked from David to Harold, sensing the tension in the air. "I'll see if the kids need help," she said, leaving the kitchen and leaving father and son alone again. David turned to the sink, his back to Harold. "So, how long do you plan to stay?" Harold hesitated. "I don't have any definite plans. Honestly, I didn't even know if you'd take me in." David turned, his eyes meeting Harold's. "Honestly? I don't know if I should have. After all these years, Dad." "Why now?" Harold felt the weight of his son's words. He knew this moment would come, the moment he'd have to be completely honest. "David, I'm sick." David frowned, worry momentarily replacing the anger in his eyes. "Sick? What do you mean?" Harold took a deep breath. "It's cancer, David. The doctors, they didn't give me much time." The shock on David's face was palpable. He leaned against the kitchen counter as if his legs suddenly couldn't support his weight. "How much time?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A few months, maybe," Harold replied softly. "That's why I'm taking this trip. I realized I had things to fix, people to see, mistakes to try to make right." David closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a mixture of anger, sadness, and confusion in his gaze. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? Why wait until now?" Harold shook his head, feeling the weight of his mistakes. "I was a coward, David. I spent years staying away, convincing myself it was too late to fix things. And then, when I got the diagnosis, well, I guess I needed a push from fate to finally do the right thing." David was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "Have you told Sarah?" Harold shook his head. "Not yet. I was thinking of going to California after this, if you think it's a good idea." Before David could respond, the sound of running footsteps interrupted the conversation. Emily and Michael came back into the kitchen, their faces clean and eyes shining with curiosity. "Daddy," Emily said, tugging on David's sleeve, "can we show Grandpa Harold our drawings?" David looked at his daughter and then at Harold, indecision clear in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Sure, sweetheart. Why don't you take Grandpa to the living room?" The children smiled and each took one of Harold's hands, gently pulling him out of the kitchen. Harold cast one last look at David, who still seemed to be struggling with his emotions. In the living room, Emily and Michael bombarded Harold with questions and stories, showing him their favorite toys and the drawings they had made at school. Harold found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in a long time, marveling at the energy and innocence of his grandchildren. Claire joined them, sitting in a nearby armchair and watching the interaction with a cautious smile. She could see the joy in Harold's eyes, but she also noticed how he occasionally looked toward the kitchen, where David had yet to emerge. After a few minutes, David finally appeared in the doorway, his eyes red as if he had been crying. He watched the scene before him, his father, the man who had been absent for so long, now sitting on the floor, laughing with his children. Harold looked up and met David's gaze. There was a moment of silent understanding between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. David came closer and sat on the couch. "Hey, kids," he said softly, "how about we show Grandpa Harold that old photo album?" The children agreed enthusiastically, and soon Harold found himself surrounded by his family, looking at photos of moments he had missed but determined to be part of the future, however short that future might be. As the afternoon turned into evening, the atmosphere in David's house slowly changed. The initial tension gave way to a cautious acceptance. Stories were shared, laughter was exchanged, and little by little, the pieces of a long-broken family began to come back together. Harold knew there was still a long way to go. One visit wouldn't erase years of absence. But as he watched David laugh at a joke Michael had told, and felt Emily's small hand holding his, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Harold's journey to redemption was far from over. There was still Sarah to visit in California, and many difficult conversations ahead. But at that moment, sitting in his son's living room, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a reunited family, Harold allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for a new beginning. The days that followed Harold's arrival were an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. David oscillated between moments of genuine connection with his father and bouts of pent-up anger that exploded at the most unexpected moments. Claire acted as a peacemaker, trying to smooth the edges between father and son, while the children, unaware of the complexity of the situation, simply enjoyed the presence of their new grandfather. One particularly tense afternoon, after a heated argument about the past, Harold decided to go for a walk to cool his head. He walked aimlessly through the streets of Chicago, his thoughts a whirlwind of regrets and hopes. Without realizing it, he found himself on the shores of Lake Michigan. The vast body of water stretched to the horizon, its gentle waves reflecting the cloudy sky above. Harold sat on a nearby bench, watching the families and couples strolling along the waterfront. "Mind if I sit?" A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was David. Harold nodded, surprised and a little apprehensive. David sat next to him, and for a few moments, they remained silent, watching the lake. "You know," David began, his voice soft, "when I was a kid, we used to come here on weekends. You, me, and Mom." Harold felt a tightening in his chest. "I remember," he said. "You used to love throwing stones into the water, trying to make them skip." David let out a soft laugh. "Yeah, I was never very good at it." Another moment of silence followed, but this time it was less tense, more contemplative. "Dad," David finally spoke, turning to face Harold, "I spent so much time angry at you. Angry for not being there, angry for missing so many important moments. But now," he paused, swallowing hard. "Now that I know our time is limited, I realize I don't want to waste what we have left being angry." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes. "David, I'm so sorry. For everything. I know saying sorry doesn't erase what I did, or rather, what I didn't do. But I want you to know that I deeply regret it. If I could go back." David raised his hand, interrupting him gently. "We can't change the past, Dad. But maybe we can do something with the present." Harold nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. I'd really like that, son. David took a deep breath, as if making a difficult decision. I've been thinking, maybe it's time we call Sarah. Together. Harold felt his heart leap. The idea of talking to his daughter, of trying to fix another broken relationship, was both exciting and terrifying. Do you think she'll want to talk to me? David shrugged. Honestly? I don't know. Sarah was always the more stubborn of the two of us. But I think she deserves to know what's going on. And maybe it's time for our family to try to come together again. Harold nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for his son. Thank you, David, for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it, but... Dad, David interrupted, his voice firm but gentle, everyone deserves a second chance. Even absent fathers who show up out of nowhere with terminal diagnoses. There was a touch of humor in his voice, a sign that things were slowly improving between them. Harold laughed, feeling some of the tension he carried dissipate. Well, when you put it like that. They stayed there for a while longer, talking about the past, the present, and the uncertain future they had ahead. When they finally got up to head back home, both felt as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Back at David's house, they found Claire in the kitchen, making dinner. She looked at the two of them with a mix of surprise and relief, seeing that both seemed more relaxed. Everything okay? She asked cautiously. David approached her, giving her a gentle kiss. Yeah, sweetheart. Actually, I think it's better than it's been in a long time. That night, after dinner and after the kids had gone to bed, David, Claire, and Harold gathered in the living room. David held the phone, looking nervously at his father. Ready? He asked. Harold took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. As ready as I'll ever be. David nodded and dialed the number. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity as they waited. Finally, a woman's voice answered on the other end of the line. Hello? Sarah? David said. It's David. I have someone here who wants to talk to you. There was a pause on the other end of the line. David, what is this about? Who's there? David looked at Harold, who nodded encouragingly. It's Dad, Sarah. He's here, and there's a lot we need to talk about. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, Harold feared Sarah would just hang up. But then her voice returned, laden with emotion. Put it on speakerphone, she said. David complied, placing the phone on the coffee table. Harold leaned forward, his heart pounding. Sarah, he said, his voice trembling. It's your dad. Dad, Sarah responded, her voice a mix of shock and confusion. What? Why? Harold closed his eyes, gathering his courage. Sarah, sweetheart, there's so much I need to tell you. So many things to explain, to apologize for. And so, in that living room in Chicago, with David and Claire as silent witnesses, Harold began to tell his story. He spoke of his mistakes, his regrets, about his illness, and his journey to redemption. As the words flowed, emotions overflowed. Tears were shed, voices rose in moments of pain and anger, but there were also moments of understanding and, perhaps, the beginning of forgiveness. The conversation lasted hours, stretching late into the night. When they finally finished, emotionally and physically exhausted, a decision had been made. Sarah agreed to come to Chicago. The Winters family, long fractured, would give reconciliation a chance. As Harold prepared to sleep that night, in his guest room, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a lonely man facing a death sentence, he now found himself in the midst of a family that, despite the wounds of the past, was willing to try again. Looking out the window at the Chicago night sky, Harold felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult. There was much to resolve, many wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel hope. His last wish, the wish for reconciliation and forgiveness, was slowly becoming a reality. And even if his time was limited, Harold was determined to make every moment count. The days following the Winters family reunion were a bittersweet mix of joy and melancholy. Harold, determined to make every moment count, dove headfirst into the family life he had long neglected. The days were filled with simple but meaningful activities. He helped Emily with her homework, listening patiently as she read aloud, her small finger following the words on the page. With Michael, he spent hours in the backyard, teaching the boy to play baseball, laughing at missed balls, and celebrating every successful hit. Sarah decided to extend her stay, working remotely from David's house. She and Harold spent mornings on the porch, drinking coffee and slowly rebuilding their relationship. The conversations were sometimes difficult, tears were shed, but there were also laughter and moments of mutual understanding. One afternoon, while Harold watched Sarah drawing with Emily, he couldn't help but notice how his daughter had inherited Martha's artistic talent. "You look so much like your mother," he commented softly. Sarah looked at him, surprised. "I always thought I looked more like you." Harold smiled. "Maybe in stubbornness," he joked, earning a reluctant smile from Sarah. "But your eyes, your talent, that's pure Martha." "Tell me about her," Sarah asked, putting her pencil aside. "About you too, in the beginning." And so, Harold began to share stories that had long been buried in his memory. He talked about how he met Martha at a college party, how he was captivated by her laughter and her passion for art. He told about the disastrous first date when he spilled coffee on his shirt and how Martha laughed, saying it only made him more charming. David joined them, sitting on the floor with Michael on his lap. The children listened, fascinated, to these stories of a grandmother they had never met and a grandfather they were only just beginning to know. As the days passed, Harold's health began to decline gradually. There were days when he felt too weak to get out of bed, but even then, his family gathered around him. David read to him from the newspaper, Sarah showed him her new drawings, and the children filled the room with their laughter and stories from school. One particularly good afternoon, Harold suggested a picnic in the park. The whole family went, carrying baskets of food and a colorful blanket. As they sat in the shade of a large oak tree, Harold watched his family. David and Claire, holding hands, watching the children play. Sarah, laughing at something Emily had said. It was at that moment that Harold realized that his last wish had turned into something greater than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about his own forgiveness or redemption. It was about giving his family the chance to be whole, to heal old wounds, and to create new memories. "Is everything okay?" Claire asked, noticing Harold's distant look. He smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in years. "Yes," he replied. "I'm just grateful for all of this." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Harold sat on the porch, looking at the stars. He thought about Jake, the young man he had met at the beginning of his journey. He wondered how he was doing, hoping that he, too, had found his way back home. Harold knew his time was running out. He could feel it in his bones, in the fatigue that seemed to deepen each day. But instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment. He had set out in search of redemption and found much more. He found the forgiveness of his children, the joy of knowing his grandchildren, and the chance to finally be the father and grandfather he always should have been. In the days that followed, Harold made sure to have individual moments with each member of the family. With David, he shared advice about fatherhood and expressed his pride in the man his son had become. With Sarah, he spent hours looking through her old sketchbooks, marveling at the talent she had cultivated over the years. For Emily and Michael, he recorded videos, telling stories from his youth, sharing life lessons, and expressing how much he loved them, even having known them for such a short time. One night, feeling that his time was truly coming to an end, Harold gathered the entire family in the living room. "I want you all to know," he began, his voice weak but determined, "that these last few months have been the most precious of my life. I know I can't erase the mistakes of the past, but I hope I've shown you how much I love you, how much you all mean to me." Silent tears ran down everyone's faces as Harold continued. "David, Sarah," he said, looking at his children, "you are my greatest pride. The strength you have, the kindness in your hearts, it's something far beyond anything I could have done. It's who you are." Turning to Claire, he smiled. "Thank you for taking such good care of my boy, and for giving me the chance to be part of this family." Finally, he addressed Emily and Michael. "My little ones," Harold said, his voice choked with emotion, "you have brought so much light to my life in such a short time. Always remember that Grandpa loves you very, very much." The family gathered around Harold, enveloping him in a collective hug. Tears were shed freely, but there were also smiles of gratitude for this precious time they had shared. In the days that followed, Harold's health declined rapidly. He spent most of his time in bed, but never alone. His family took turns, making sure someone was always by his side. One afternoon, while Sarah read to him from one of his favorite books, Harold felt a deep peace envelop him. He looked out the window, seeing the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Sarah," he called softly. She stopped reading, leaning closer. "Yes, Dad? Do you think your mom would be proud of us?" Sarah held her father's hand, tears shining in her eyes. "I'm sure she would, Dad. I'm sure she would." Harold smiled, feeling light. "You know, when I got the diagnosis, I thought I was going on a journey to fulfill my last wish. But now I realize that my true last wish was this, to be here, with all of you." Sarah squeezed his hand, unable to speak through her tears. "Call your brother," Harold asked softly. "I think it's time." Minutes later, the entire family was gathered in the room. David and Sarah sat on either side of the bed, holding their father's hands. Claire stood at the foot of the bed, the children close to her. "I love you all," Harold said, his voice barely a whisper. "Always remember that." With one last serene smile, Harold closed his eyes. The Winters family remained united, crying silently, as the patriarch they had rediscovered passed away peacefully. In the days that followed, as they dealt with the loss, the family found themselves sharing stories about Harold, not just from the past few months, but from an entire lifetime. They laughed at the bad jokes he used to tell, remembered the small gestures of love he had shown. At the funeral, David and Sarah stood side by side, their hands intertwined in mutual support. As they watched the casket being lowered into the ground, Sarah turned to her brother. "You know," she said softly, "I think, in the end, he really did it." David looked at her, curious. "Did what?" "His last wish," Sarah replied with a sad smile. "He brought us together. Made us a family again." David nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yeah, I think he did." Weeks later, when the dust had settled and routine began to return to normal, the family gathered for dinner. At the center of the table was a photo of Harold, smiling next to his grandchildren. Before they began eating, David raised his glass in a toast. "To Dad," he said, his voice firm. "May we always remember that it's never too late to make things right, to love, to forgive." "To Dad," everyone echoed, their glasses clinking in the air. And so, Harold Winter's journey came to an end. But the impact of his last wish continued to reverberate through the generations. The Winters family, once fragmented, was now more united than ever. They carried with them not only Harold's memory but also the lessons he had taught them in his final days, about love, forgiveness, and the importance of valuing every moment with those we love. In a hotel room somewhere in the country, Jake Morrison smiled as he saw a photo in the local newspaper. It was a family photo taken in a park. In the center, an elderly man smiled, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. The caption read, "Harold Winters, remembered with love." Jake traced the image with his finger, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Harold," he murmured, "for showing me the way back home." He carefully folded the newspaper and put it in his bag. Tomorrow, he would return to his own family. It was time to make things right, to make peace. After all, as Harold had taught him, it's never too late for a new beginning. And so, Harold Winters' story came to an end. But his legacy, of love, forgiveness, and redemption, lived on, touching lives far beyond those he had known in his final days. His last wish had become an enduring gift, a reminder to all of us that, as long as there is life, there is hope for healing and reconciliation. I hope you enjoyed this story full of twists and emotions. If you liked it and want more exciting narratives like this, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the Stories Life channel. Here, every story is a new adventure, and we're always ready to surprise you. Also, leave your comments about what you thought of the story and suggestions for future narratives. See you next time.